My parents said, "This trip isn't about you on our family vacation," so I froze their card before dessert even hit the table. That line sounds dramatic. I know, but drama has never been my style. I'm not the storm-throwing kind, not the one to flip a table or storm out in tears. I'm the kind who calculates wind direction, waits for the tide, and sails away while the house behind me quietly sinks under the weight of its own rot. My name is Trudy Styler. I'm 42, a financial crisis consultant based in Portland, Oregon. My job is to walk into chaotic boardrooms, balance impossible ledgers, and clean up fiscal disasters that no one wants to admit they caused. It's ironic, really. I fix broken systems for a living, but I spent years pretending my own family wasn't one. For context, I'm the eldest daughter of Margot and Royce Styler. Royce passed away 6 years ago from cancer. He was quiet, observant, the only one who ever called me first. Margot is very much alive, sharp-tongued, radiant in public, and an expert at weaponizing grace. My sister Candace, 4 years younger, works in wellness PR in Charleston. She's beautiful, bubbly, and allergic to accountability. She married Noah, who barely speaks in group chats, but somehow still manages to reap every benefit of being in the fold. They have a daughter. Eliza, 12, who calls me Aunt Trudy when she wants something, and the extra adult when she doesn't. I was never supposed to move away. Portland was my rebellion, my escape, my oxygen. But I never truly disconnected. I flew back every holiday. I sent money when Eliza needed braces, when Candace's car broke down, when Margot's roof started leaking. They never asked directly. That's not their style. Instead, they told stories of things they couldn't afford, waited for my silence, then thanked me as if the decision was mutual. I thought I was helping. I thought I was keeping peace. But peace, as it turns out, is often just a prettier word for quiet submission. This summer was supposed to be different. I booked a beach house in the Outer Banks, 6 bedrooms, oceanfront, private dock. I covered the cost of flights, groceries, even arranged matching gift bags for everyone. I told myself this was the reset, 1 week of real reconnection, 1 week to feel included, not just responsible, but from the moment I arrived, suitcase in hand, rolling across the gravel path to that Pinterest-perfect vacation home. I knew. The energy was off. Eliza ran past me with a new GoPro, shouting for her mom. Margot greeted me like I was an Airbnb host. Candace was already 2 glasses deep into her week-off wine sangria, camera ready and radiating performative joy. The welcome t-shirts were laid out on the counter navy blue, with white cursive that read Styler Family Summer 2024. I smiled, touched the fabric. Then I saw the names Margot, Royce in tribute, Candace, Noah, Eliza, no Trudy. I checked again. Nothing. I asked, lightly, did I miss mine? Candace giggled. Oh, maybe it's in the laundry. Or the order glitched, Margot added, without looking up from her Kindle. Sweetheart, don't be so sensitive. It's just a shirt. That night, we had dinner on the patio, shrimp boil, cornbread, arugula salad. I had bought the ingredients. I had arranged the delivery. I had even marinated the shrimp before they arrived. But at the table, no one mentioned it. The conversation flowed around me like I wasn't even there. Eliza was talking about camp. Noah chimed in about a new job lead. Candace shared her latest brand collab, something about chakra mists and bamboo pillows. I passed the butter. I smiled too much. I laughed too little. And then it happened. And Margot folded her napkin into a triangle, placed it delicately on the table, and turned to me. Trudy, she said, voice full of polite poison, we appreciate all the logistics, but this trip isn't about you. Please don't make it about yourself. The words were sanded smooth. the kind that don't leave a mark until later. But in that moment, something shifted. Not anger, not even sadness, just clarity. I looked around the table. No one defended me. Not Candace, not Noah, not even Eliza. They kept chewing, sipping, scrolling. I nodded once, excused myself early, and stood on the balcony that night staring at the ocean like it owed me an answer. Back in my room, the smallest one, tucked beside the laundry closet, I lay in bed and opened my voicemail folder. There it was, Royce, saved under Don't Delete. His voice was slower than I remembered, gravelly from chemo, but still firm. He had called a few weeks before he passed. I'd hosted a family dinner then, too, paid for everything, got left out of the toast. You don't have to prove your place to people who never planned to make room for you, he said in the message. Just because you carry them doesn't mean they see you as strong. Sometimes they just think you're furniture. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't pack. I just lay there, my mind scanning receipts like a ledger. How much had I paid to feel this disposable? How long had I bankrolled a fantasy that erased me from the narrative I didn't know what I would do next? Not exactly, but I knew the silence had ended, not in a loud, scorched earth way, in a colder, sharper way, the kind that doesn't knock on doors, it changes the locks. And so, while they dreamed in their curated linens and candle-scented sheets, I opened my banking app and hovered over the freeze card button. Just a test. I told myself, just a moment. But the truth was, the decision had already been made the second Margot said, "This trip isn't about you." I woke early the next morning, long before the rest of the house stirred. The hallway smelled like ocean breeze, mixed with lavender dryer sheets. I passed by the kitchen, where a chalkboard sign now read, "Breakfast at 9, hosted by Candace." It was written in pink cursive, with a little heart drawn beside her name. My name, again, was nowhere. I stood there for a second, not out of shock anymore, but confirmation. They weren't forgetting me. They were editing me out, like an image cropped from the frame, like a credit quietly deleted before the final cut. I made coffee in silence, the kind no one else drank because it was too bold. I poured it into the travel mug I had brought from home, sat on the back deck, and watched the tide pull away from the shore like even it was trying to leave. At 9:12, I heard laughter inside, the kind that swells when someone's telling a story you're not invited into. I didn't go in. Instead, I sat with my phone and opened the family finance spreadsheet I'd built last spring, color-coded tabs, travel, meals, gifts, services, each one with my initials in the paid by column. It wasn't just this trip. It never was. I had been quietly footing the emotional and financial bill for years. A memory bubbled up. Uninvited. Eliza's 8th birthday. Candace had been between jobs. Margot said the party would have to be modest that year. I wired money for the cake, the magician, the custom invitations with unicorns printed in gold foil. The thank you card arrived 3 weeks later. Signed by Candace and Eliza. Not a single mention of me. I remember showing it to Royce and him saying, "Sometimes they don't say thank you because they know it makes it real." At the time, I thought he meant it as comfort. Now I realized it was a warning. When I finally walked back inside, Eliza was showing off her new phone case to Noah, a sparkling pink shell with her name printed in rhinestones. Candace clapped her hands and said, "Isn't it adorable? We picked it out together last week." But Trudy's card handled the rest. Everyone laughed, like it was cute, like I was some generous ghost swiping silently in the background. I said nothing, smiled like it didn't scrape the inside of my chest. They didn't even notice the pause in my breath. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. Later that afternoon, we headed out for a group photo by the dock. Margot had arranged for a local photographer to come and take candid family shots. Everyone was in coordinated outfits, beige, linen, sundresses, and boat shoes. I had brought a dress too, navy blue, simple, elegant. But when I stepped outside, Margot looked me over and said, "Didn't you get the text? We agreed on earth tones." Candace chimed in. "Maybe she can stand in the back or take the photo for us instead." I said nothing, just stood at the edge of the lawn while they adjusted angles and brightness. The photographer asked, "Who's the organizer?" Candace raised her hand. "All me." I raised my camera, pretended to capture the moment. But what I really did was record the silence, the space I was edited out of with surgical precision. That evening, we had dinner at a seafood restaurant overlooking the water. I had made the reservation 3 weeks in advance. 6 people. I had confirmed it twice when we arrived. The hostess smiled and asked. "Name," I replied. "Styler. Trudy Styler." She scanned her tablet, then nodded. 6 guests, paid in full. You're all set." Candace turned to me and whispered with exaggerated sweetness, "You didn't have to pay in advance, but thanks. As always." "You're the planner," Margot added. "She loves control. Let her have it." They laughed again. I didn't. As we waited for the check, Eliza looked up from her coloring sheet and said, "Grandma says you work too much because you waste money." The table went silent for half a breath. Candace chuckled awkwardly. "Kids repeat everything, don't they?" Margot sipped her white wine and said, "Well, she's not wrong." I stared down at the receipt that had just arrived: 3 seafood platters, 2 bottles of wine, and a $240 tab. I handed the server my card. He smiled. "Thank you, Miss Styler. The last few nights." 2, I nodded. "Yes, all of them." His eyebrows lifted slightly, like he hadn't expected that. Neither had I. I hadn't planned to track the receipts until that moment, but something in me clicked. It wasn't bitterness. It was bookkeeping. Back at the house, I opened my laptop. I wasn't angry. I was accurate. I clicked through the expenses from the past 5 days. Flights, $2,180. House rental, $400. Grocery runs, $680. Excursions, $920. And now this dinner. I created a folder on my desktop, labeled it Emotional Audit. I didn't plan to confront anyone yet. I just needed to see it laid bare, to see the shape of the gap between what I gave and what I meant to them. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was reflection. Around midnight, I passed by the kitchen and heard Margot's voice drifting in from the porch. She was on the phone, telling someone about her lovely vacation, about how Candace had taken care of everything, about how Eliza was thriving, about how Trudy's here too. But she's always so tired. I think she resents us for being close. I leaned against the fridge, steady, quiet. The truth is, I didn't resent their closeness. I resented the cost of pretending I was part of it. The next morning, I woke up to find my name missing from the breakfast schedule. Candace had drawn up a board, each family member assigned a task. Eliza was in charge of fruit, Noah, coffee. Candace would prep eggs. Margot would set the table, beside Trudy. In light gray pencil, I erased it, not with spite, but precision. Then I picked up the breakfast tray, arranged it for myself, and stepped onto the deck. Letting the door swing gently shut behind me, I had nothing to prove to a household that already voted me off their island while using my money to build it. The decision wasn't made in a flash of emotion. It came in layers, quiet, undeniable, steady as accounting. And by the time I poured my second cup of coffee that morning, I knew they weren't going to apologize. They weren't going to see me, but they were still spending me. And that, at least, I could control that afternoon. While the others were out on the boardwalk, looking for saltwater taffy and seashell bracelets. I stayed behind, not because I had work, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to listen. I had started noticing how often they spoke about me when they thought I wasn't around. The difference between what they said to my face and what they said just beyond the corner of a hallway was subtle, but clear. They softened their tone when I was present, then sharpened it the moment I stepped away. So I didn't step away anymore. I sat quietly by the kitchen island, scrolling through emails while Candace and Margot chatted just outside the screen door, unaware I was within earshot. "She's always been like this," Margot said, her voice syrupy and controlled, intense. "She doesn't know how to relax. Everything's a task to her." Candace laughed, casually cruel. "Remember when she cried at my baby shower because no one mentioned her speech? She just sees a fence in every shadow." Margot sighed. "We've tried to include her, but she takes up so much emotional space." "Yeah," Candace added, and then acts shocked when people avoid her. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I simply opened the voice memo app on my phone and tapped record. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. If they were going to rewrite me into the villain of their story, I was going to keep the original script. Later that evening, Eliza came bounding in from the beach, her cheeks sun-flushed and sand clinging to her ankles. She jumped into Margot's lap with the ease of someone who knows she's loved without condition. "Grandma," she said, "did you book the dolphin cruise yet?" Margot winked. "Already handled. Baby girl. All 6 tickets confirmed." I blinked. 6. I looked around. Margot, Candace, Noah, Eliza, even the photographer they'd befriended from earlier. I checked my email. No confirmation, no invite, no mention. I opened the banking app. There it was. Outer Banks charters, $675, processed through the backup card I had given Margot 2 years ago, labeled for emergencies only. Apparently, dolphin sightings now counted as emergencies. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I took a screenshot. Then I opened a new folder in my Notes app. I named it Emotional Receipts. Inside it, I began placing the screenshots, voice recordings, and calendar gaps that traced the quiet, systematic erasure of me from the family I'd been funding. It wasn't revenge. Not yet, but it was a firewall, a slow, steady shift from silent support to silent observation. At dinner, they toasted again. Candace raised her glass to the most unforgettable family week. Noah nodded and added, "This really brought us closer." Margot placed her hand on Candace's. "You made it all so seamless. No one mentioned the booking emails, the grocery lists, the deposits. Me. I was in the photo but not in the caption, in the room but not in the memory. After dessert, I slipped away and sat in the hallway outside the laundry room, the only space left that hadn't been claimed by someone else. I checked the shared family spreadsheet. It had been updated without my name on the tabs. Candace had renamed the primary budget sheet Styler Summer, Candace's planner. I stared at it, not in shock, just confirmation. Again. The next morning, I quietly began to draw back when the boat tour came. I stayed home, said I wasn't feeling well. No one questioned it. No one offered to stay. They left in matching windbreakers and branded tote bags, the kind I had paid for last month as a surprise. The only surprise was how easily they had written me out of the itinerary. I spent that morning on the porch swing, sipping black coffee, re-listening to Royce's voicemail. I let it settle into me like oxygen. "Just because you show up," he had said, "doesn't mean they'll see you. But that doesn't make you invisible. It makes them blind." I walked past Eliza's room that evening. Her door was cracked. She was FaceTiming a friend. "It's just us here," she said, flipping the camera toward the living room. Well, and Aunt Trudy, but she's more like the staff. She didn't mean it to hurt. That was the worst part. She didn't say it with malice. She said it because it had been taught to her quietly, constantly, until it sounded like truth. I closed the door softly, not to scold her, but to preserve what little of myself was still intact in that house. That night, over grilled chicken and lukewarm lemonade, Candace turned to me. "You've been a bit detached this week," she said, smiling in that way that isn't friendly. "Are you okay?" I wanted to ask her if she meant before or after I was cropped out of every photo, before or after I paid for the vacation I wasn't invited to enjoy. But instead, I just said, "I'm fine, just observing." Margot narrowed her eyes, observing what I smiled gently. Patterns. The silence that followed tasted like victory, small but undeniable. After dinner, while they set up for board games on the patio, I walked back to my room, locked the door, and sat with my laptop. I opened the financial dashboard. My fingers hovered over the linked cards section. 5 users, 4 active, 1 me. I didn't click freeze, not yet, but I looked each one in the eye and whispered something only I could hear. You don't need to punish them to reclaim yourself. You just need to stop sponsoring your own erasure. By then, the phrase toxic family betrayal had taken a shape in my chest I could name. It wasn't about fights or screaming matches. It was about quiet exclusions dressed in polite smiles. It was the slow bleed of your identity under the weight of someone else's version of you. And I wasn't going to bleed anymore. That morning started with the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself. It hangs low in the air, quiet, sticky, clinging to every movement. The house was unusually coordinated, too quiet, too rehearsed. I walked into the kitchen and immediately sensed it. Margot was at the sink arranging lemon slices into a glass pitcher like it was a centerpiece audition. Candace hovered by the stove with a notebook in hand, her tone light but directive. So brunch is at 10:30, paddleboards at 1, dinner at 7. She didn't look up as she spoke, just wrote. Noah was already outside checking cooler inventory. Eliza sat at the table in a dolphin print t-shirt, legs swinging, absorbed in a game on her tablet. I waited for someone to look up. No one did. I walked toward the counter and scanned the itinerary written on the chalkboard. My name wasn't listed on any of the activities, not even the brunch I had personally arranged 3 weeks in advance with the Coastal Inn down the road. "Is there a reason I'm not in the plan today?" I asked evenly. Candace replied too quickly. "You mentioned needing rest days. We just didn't want to pressure you." I hadn't said that. I didn't even think that. Margot chimed in without turning around. "We're just trying to be thoughtful." Sweetheart, it wasn't thoughtfulness. It was a quiet erasure dressed as concern. I nodded once, poured a cup of black coffee, and stepped out to the porch. Not because I needed the fresh air, but because I needed distance from the fiction. I sat there for 37 minutes, watching waves roll in patterns that made more sense than my own family. It wasn't grief anymore. It was precision. I opened my phone, checked the bank app, and confirmed it again. The Dolphin cruise charged to my backup card had been processed the same morning. Margot told me she wouldn't touch a dime of mine this trip. I clicked into the ledger, opened the detail log, and quietly began taking notes. Spa appointments in April, brunch for 6 in May, a wine delivery subscription ordered last December, everything under the same emergency card I'd left her access to in good faith. Now reduced to a family tab I never agreed to open, I didn't freeze the card, not yet. But I did flag every charge and screenshot each one into a folder labeled Quiet Audit. I wasn't building a case to confront them. I was documenting a pattern for myself, for the version of me that had been gaslighted too long to trust her own memory. By the time I walked back inside, the living room was buzzing with excitement. Candace was showing off her outfit to Eliza, twirling in a linen romper. Margot was handing out canvas tote bags with each person's name stenciled on the front. Everyone had one except me. I didn't ask. I didn't joke. I simply stood there, absorbing the choreography of it all. They weren't forgetting me. They were practicing life without me, using this vacation as the dress rehearsal. Eliza looked up and said casually, "Grandma said you like being alone anyway, so we didn't want to bug you." I blinked slowly. She didn't say it cruelly. That was what stung most. She said it as a fact, a truth rehearsed and handed down. I gave her a small smile and replied, "That's very thoughtful." She went back to her tablet. Margot turned to Candace and asked if the paddleboards were confirmed. Candace nodded. "Booked for 6. I raised one eyebrow. There were 7 of us. I knew the missing seat wasn't a mistake. That evening, while they prepared dinner, I stayed in my room and listened through the paper-thin walls. I heard Margot's voice, half whispering, perfectly enunciated. She's just so hard to include. She makes everything so heavy. You feel it. Right, Candace responded. Honestly. Yeah, like you always have to adjust around her mood. They weren't angry. They weren't even hiding. They were just comfortable. Comfortable enough to discuss my emotional worth, like it was an allergy no one wanted to accommodate. I didn't cry. I didn't clench my fists. I picked up my phone and hit record. It wasn't out of revenge. It was preservation. I wanted proof, not for them, for me. Because when the gaslighting inevitably came, when they claimed I was overreacting or misremembering, I would have timestamps. At dinner, Candace raised a glass and toasted to a week we'll never forget. Noah added, "The energy has been amazing." Margot looked toward Eliza and handed her a small jewelry box. For being the heart of this family, inside was a silver charm bracelet with engraved initials, M for Margot, C for Candace, N for Noah, E for Eliza, even an R for Royce, no T. I looked down at my plate and said nothing. No one noticed, or maybe they did and chose not to speak. I placed my napkin on the table, excused myself, and walked down to the beach, letting the salt air dissolve the growing burn in my throat. When I returned, the dishwasher was humming, and everyone was gathered around the TV watching a slideshow Candace had assembled, a digital collage of photos from the trip so far, dock moments, morning brunches, candid beach laughter, each one with filters applied, captions like "Forever Us" and "Family over everything." I watched as one image faded into the next, none of them including me, and then it hit me. I had taken every single one of those photos. The phone used was mine. The angles were mine. The light adjustments. The moments captured mid-laughter. The illusion of unity mine. I stood behind the couch and watched the last slide fade to black. Eliza turned and saw me. "That was sweet, huh?" I smiled faintly. "Very." Then I walked to my room and sat down at my laptop, logged in, opened the financial dashboard, reviewed every active subscription, every linked device, every tool they used, but never acknowledged who had built it. My name was on every back end. Their photos were public, but I was the infrastructure. And tonight, for the first time, I understood what it meant to take your name off the utility bill. I didn't click anything, not yet, but I hovered over the freeze access button and whispered quietly, "When the lights go out, remember who paid the power." The house was buzzing with excitement the next morning. Candace had planned a surprise early birthday celebration for Margot, and by planned. I mean, she had picked a theme and assigned everyone else tasks. I had already paid the bakery deposit a week ago, booked the catering, and pre-ordered the coastal chic decorations that now hung across the back patio. None of that was mentioned during the toast. Candace stood, holding a glass of rosé, and said, "This whole week came together because we all pitched in, but I really wanted to do something special for Mom." She turned toward Margot, who beamed like a pageant queen. "You're the anchor of this family," Candace continued, "and we love you for it." I stood at the edge of the group. Holding a platter of cupcakes no one had asked me to bake, but everyone had eaten without hesitation. Not a single mention of the receipts I had in my inbox. Not a glance toward the woman who funded the anchor's celebration. Just a sea of clinking glasses and filtered smiles. I watched as Eliza handed her grandmother a custom photo album. The front page read, "Summer with the Stylers, a legacy of love." The photos inside were glossy and curated, a highlight reel of the week so far. Doc selfies, dinner table laughs, sunrise yoga. I wasn't in a single one. I recognized every moment, though, because I had taken most of them. When Margot flipped to a page labeled Candid Moments, she paused. One of the images was a shot of me walking along the beach alone. My back turned to the camera. The caption beneath it said, "A quiet guest." They all laughed. I didn't. Later that evening, while they were prepping for the final group dinner, I sat alone at the end of the long dining table, scrolling through my banking dashboard. I didn't need revenge. I needed alignment. I had spent years bending to make things easier, quieter, more manageable for everyone but myself. That phase was done. I pulled up every platform tied to the Styler family ecosystem: grocery delivery, shared ride accounts, spa memberships, streaming services, every login in my name, every charge linked to my cards. I opened the folder labeled Final Actions and started checking off boxes. It wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Freeze this, pause that, revoke access, change passwords. Not out of anger, out of clarity. I was simply turning off the utilities in a house I no longer lived in. The dinner that night was lit with fairy lights and overly planned sincerity. Candace had arranged the seating, placing me at the far end of the table near the outdoor heater that no one turned on. As the wine flowed and the conversations got louder, Margot leaned forward and said, "Trudy, you've been so quiet this week, not your usual helpful self." I smiled, folded my napkin slowly, and replied, "Maybe I've just been recalibrating." Candace cocked her head. "Are you upset about something?" she asked. The words dressed in concern but delivered like a challenge. I looked at her and said calmly, "Not upset, just paying attention." The silence that followed was sharp. Even Noah looked up from his plate. Eliza stopped mid-bite. Margot laughed nervously and said, "Well, whatever this energy is, it's casting a bit of a shadow on the evening." I nodded. Funny. I thought I was the one being kept in the dark. I reached into my pocket, took out my phone, and tapped play on the recording I had saved. The voices came through clearly. Margot saying I take up too much emotional space. Candace describing me as someone who ruins group dynamics. The audio lasted just under a minute. When it ended, I set the phone down and looked at each of them. I thought it might be helpful to hear what I've been hearing all week. I said, so when I finally stopped smiling and funding the fantasy, no one could say they didn't know why. No one spoke. Not at first. Margot looked like she might say something, but stopped. Candace blinked hard, then scoffed. "You recorded us." I shrugged. "You erased me." I just kept the proof. The rest of the night passed in fragmented phrases and hollow attempts to salvage tone. Eliza went to bed early. Noah retreated indoors. Candace made a show of stacking dishes. Margot tried to smooth things over with small talk about flights and weather, but it was too late. I had already left the performance. I wasn't angry. I wasn't emotional. I was free. That night, back in my room, I opened the shared family spreadsheet and removed my name from every contribution category: travel, food, activities, lodging. I clicked Leave Folder and confirmed. Then I opened the final tab, the family credit card, the one they had assumed would remain open indefinitely. I hovered for half a second, then clicked Freeze Account. Status changed to inactive. No alerts, no fanfare, just done. I slept better that night than I had in years. No alarms, no buzzing notifications, no quiet dread pressing against my chest. Just stillness, the kind that feels earned in the morning. The kitchen was quieter than usual. Margot was staring at her phone, her expression tight. Candace paced near the sink, whispering furiously into hers. Noah stood awkwardly beside the fridge. Eliza was the only one who looked confused. She turned to me and asked, "Why did Grandma say we're stuck?" I knelt beside her and said gently, "Sometimes, when people build comfort on someone else's effort, they forget it can be taken away." She looked at me, frowning slightly. "Did you take it away?" I nodded. I reclaimed it. As I packed my suitcase, I heard the tension grow behind the walls. Voices raised, cards declined, plans falling apart. But I didn't rush. I folded my clothes carefully, zipped my bag, and set it by the door. My flight wasn't for hours, but the moment was already here. The shift had happened. The story had changed. I wasn't the background character anymore. I wasn't the emotional mule they could load up with guilt and expectation. I was the woman who remembered her worth before they could drain it completely. I left the dining table before anyone had the courage to ask what happened. The power dynamics had shifted, but they hadn't realized yet. They were too used to assuming I would absorb the discomfort, that I'd explain myself just enough for them to move on without ever taking responsibility. But I didn't owe them that anymore. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat for a long moment with nothing in my hands. No laptop, no phone, just the weight of 100 moments I hadn't reacted to and the strange peace of finally deciding I never had to. The next morning, I woke early, not out of anxiety, but clarity, the kind of clarity that feels like quiet armor. The sun hadn't fully risen, but I was already dressed, suitcase zipped, and standing in front of the bathroom mirror, checking the same face they'd called tired and difficult. I didn't look tired. I looked done. The house was still mostly asleep when I walked through the kitchen, pausing only to fold one last receipt into my journal. The scent of overripe fruit and lemon cleaner filled the air. I looked around the room, the sight of a dozen unacknowledged meals I had planned, funded, and cleared. I didn't feel angry. I felt clean. Candace was the first to notice something had changed. Around mid-morning, her voice cut through the hallway like a snapped violin string. "Why is the grocery app saying access denied?" Margot's voice followed a beat later. "My card's been declined at the spa." Then Noah, quieter. "I can't get the car rental to confirm." I stood at the end of the hallway holding my phone and sipping coffee. No one asked me directly. They knew. They just didn't know how to say it. I walked past them on the way to the porch. Margot followed, her voice shifting between concern and control. "Trudy, something's wrong with the accounts. I think maybe your card got flagged." I met her eyes without blinking. No, it didn't get flagged. It got frozen. On purpose. Her face twisted for a half second before smoothing back into practiced poise. "Why would you do that?" she asked. I tilted my head. "I think a better question is why you assumed I wouldn't." Candace appeared behind her, phone still in hand. Frustration painted across her expression. "Are you trying to make a point?" I didn't respond immediately. Just set my coffee down on the porch railing, leaned back slightly, and said, "No, I already made it. You just didn't hear it the first 100 times." Margot opened her mouth, likely to say something dressed in a bow of maternal authority. But I held up one hand, palm forward. "Let me save you the trouble. I didn't shut things down to hurt you. I shut them down because it turns out the only person being hurt was me." She blinked. Candace stepped forward, her voice rising. "You can't just pull the plug in the middle of a trip." I looked at her calmly. "Actually, I can," and I did. Inside, I heard Eliza asking where her beach bag was and if the brunch reservation was still on. Noah mumbled something about calling customer service. The illusion of order was collapsing, but what they were really panicking about wasn't brunch or beach towels. It was losing control of the system they had grown dependent on. The infrastructure I had built was invisible to them until it wasn't available. And now, stripped of it, they were exposed, not to punishment, but to self-accountability. I walked back inside and past the family photo album still open on the counter. The page I'd been labeled a quiet guest on was visible. I turned it over and gently closed the cover. Candace stood at the table trying to compose a message to the grocery service. She looked up. "Trudy, this is really extreme." I shook my head. "What's extreme is funding a trip I wasn't emotionally invited to. What's extreme is being edited out of a family I've kept afloat for a decade." That afternoon, I didn't go to the beach with them. I didn't offer to take the group photo. I didn't remind them about dinner confirmations or check the weather for the boat tour. I sat on the swing chair with a paperback and a glass of cold water while the dysfunction unfolded without my coordination. At one point, Eliza came and sat beside me. She looked up and asked, "Are you mad at us?" I closed the book. "No. Honey, I'm just done helping people who don't see me." She was quiet for a minute. Then she asked, "Will you still come to my birthday next year?" I smiled softly. "That depends. Will I be invited as family or staff?" She looked confused. And that was the hardest part, because no one had told her how deeply they'd rewritten my role. She was repeating what she had learned through observation, that my presence was optional, but my labor wasn't. When they left for their last group dinner, I stayed behind and packed, not in a rush, not in anger, but with precision. I folded each item like I was folding away a version of myself that had tried too hard, stayed too long, and asked for too little. Before I zipped the suitcase, I wrote a short note and slid it into the drawer beside the bed. It read, "This was never about money. It was about being real. You chose the story." I just stopped underwriting it. Then I walked outside, booked a car to the airport, and sat on the front steps waiting. They returned just as the ride arrived. Candace saw the suitcase and said, "You're really leaving like this?" I nodded. "Exactly like this." Margot's eyes softened slightly. "We didn't mean for things to feel this way." I smiled gently. "But you meant everything you said when you thought I wasn't listening. That's the part I believe." As I got into the car, Eliza came running down the steps. "Can I hug you?" she asked. I bent down, hugged her tight, and whispered, "Don't believe everything grown-ups say about people who make boundaries, especially the quiet ones." She nodded like she didn't fully understand, but might someday. Then I got in the car and didn't look back. The drive to the airport was quiet in the best possible way. No notifications, no urgent messages, no passive-aggressive emojis in the group chat, just the hum of the road and the soft shuffle of my own breath finally slowing down. The driver asked if I had a preference for the route. I told him scenic was fine, Let the coastline pass me like a long memory. I didn't need to rehearse what happened. I had lived it fully. I had done the math, drawn the lines, and closed the loop. The weight wasn't gone, but it was no longer mine to carry. I reached the terminal an hour early and found a seat near the far window. I opened my phone and tapped into a folder labeled Final Ledger. Inside were every receipt, transfer, itinerary, and confirmation from the past 12 days. Every dollar tied to a smile I was asked to give. Every charge attached to a memory I wasn't allowed to appear in. I didn't open the files. I just looked at them as proof that I hadn't imagined the imbalance, that I wasn't overreacting, that emotional financial abuse can wear the face of family and still be theft. As I boarded the flight, I kept waiting for the rush of sadness, the guilt, the echo of voices telling me I had overstepped. But all I felt was stillness. I closed my eyes before takeoff and whispered, not a prayer, not a threat, just a truth. I'm done buying seats at tables I'm not welcome at, somewhere over Kansas. The phone I had placed on airplane mode buzzed faintly against my thigh. Once we landed and I turned it back on, the flood arrived. 27 unread messages. The family group chat had been renamed. Styler reset. I wasn't in it. Candace had texted once. If you're trying to make a point, you made it. Congrats. Then Margot. I hope one day you understand what you've done. No apology. No reflection. Just a vacuum where gratitude should have lived. I deleted both messages, not out of anger, out of clarity. I didn't need them to understand. I only needed them to lose access, back in Portland. I stepped into my apartment and was greeted not by anyone, but by my own life waiting right where I had left it. The curtains were half open. A cool breeze moved through the room like an invitation. I set my bag down, exhaled deeply, and stood in that silence for a long moment. It didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Later that evening, I made myself a real dinner. Not something quick, not something for others, just for me. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, a glass of wine that hadn't been poured in obligation. I sat at my table, alone, full, and free. I opened my laptop and typed the words, Statement of Closure, into a blank document. I wasn't planning to send it. I just needed to see it in writing. The document began, To those who loved my labor but not my presence. You won't feel the absence immediately, because absence isn't loud, but you will notice the gaps in the plans that don't make sense, in the spreadsheet's missing structure, in the errands no one runs. You'll notice when the battery dies and no one brings the charger. That's when you'll realize it was never a given. It was me. I saved the file, closed the lid, and leaned back. I wasn't waiting for a phone call anymore. I wasn't wondering if they'd apologize or send some sanitized version of an olive branch. The chapter had closed with the click of a button in a banking app. And the truth was, they'd written the ending themselves long before I enforced it. I just finally stopped editing their version of me. The next day, while walking through a local bookstore, I noticed a flyer taped to the checkout counter, Solo Women's Hiking Retreat, Zion National Park, for those starting over without needing permission. I stared at it longer than I expected. The phrase felt like it had been whispered directly to my ribs. I pulled out my phone, scanned the QR code, and registered. No need for approval, no group vote, no shared calendar. My name, my card, my decision. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post about it. I just let it be mine. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from Margot. Her tone was formal, distant, and tight. We didn't raise you to be so cold. Trudy. That was all she said. No context, just a single sentence meant to pull me back into orbit. as if her version of motherhood was the only valid one. I pressed delete without hesitation. Closure wasn't something they would give, but that didn't mean I had to stay open. I renamed my final ledger folder to archived, not as an act of forgetting, but as a way to file it where it could no longer infect the present. That afternoon, I sat in my favorite cafe near the Willamette River, watching the light shift through a window pane that no one else had an opinion about. A young woman at the next table complimented my earrings. I reached up and touched them, a pair of silver hoops I hadn't worn in over a year. "Thanks," I said. "They used to mean something else. Now they just mean me." I wasn't trying to impress her. I wasn't trying to reclaim space. I was simply existing, fully, without edit. By the end of that week, I had unsubscribed from the newsletter Candace had created, removed my name from the family photo drive, and changed every password on accounts tied to my name. Not out of malice, but because healing sometimes looks like revoking access to systems that hurt you, even when those systems call themselves love. The truth is, walking away from a toxic family story doesn't come with fireworks or applause. It comes with quiet mornings where you don't flinch, dinners where you taste the food instead of resentment, sleep that doesn't require white noise to drown out your thoughts. It comes with realizing that silence isn't the absence of connection. Sometimes it's the beginning of peace. A few days after the hiking retreat confirmation, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something in me said, "Pick up." On the other end, it was Noah. His voice was low, almost apologetic, like he knew he wasn't the one who should be calling, but also knew he was the only one they could convince to do it. He asked how I was. I said I was well. He hesitated, then said they were having trouble with the hotel reservation for the next family trip and couldn't access the group travel account I had always managed. I waited a beat, then replied calmly, "That's correct. It's no longer available." He paused. "So, is this forever?" I said. "If by this you mean me not subsidizing a dynamic that deletes me, then yes, forever sounds about right." He didn't argue. He didn't push. He just said, "Okay, I get it," and hung up. I appreciated that he didn't pretend to understand, but still respected the line I drew. That night, I sat by my window with a cup of mint tea and let myself replay the question, "Is this forever?" The old version of me would have heard that as a warning, something heavy with guilt and emotional consequence. But this version, the one who had reclaimed her voice, not with speeches, but with decisions, heard it differently. It sounded like freedom, not running away, just walking somewhere else without explaining the map. Later that week, I passed by a local art gallery and saw a series of photographs displayed in the window. They were raw and honest, black and white portraits of women sitting alone in rooms that looked too big for them. The plaque beneath the exhibit said, "Solitude isn't absence, it's ownership." I stood there for a long while, longer than I meant to, before walking in and buying a postcard version of the image that struck me most. A woman seated at a bare table, one chair pulled out, one plate in front of her, and nothing else. Not in sadness, in power. That image now sits on my desk, next to the journal I used to keep full of to-do lists for other people. Those pages are empty now. Instead, I've started writing letters I never send, not to them, but to the woman I used to be, the one who checked the guest list 5 times, the one who stayed late to clean up the party no one credited her for, the one who bought the camera and never appeared in the pictures. I thank her, because without her, I wouldn't have recognized when it was time to stop. A few evenings later, I received an email from Candace. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but every word was careful. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply wrote, "I didn't realize how much you carried. That's on me. I hope one day we can talk." I didn't respond, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I'd learned that recognition is only the first step. Repair takes more than acknowledgement. It takes accountability. And I wasn't going to carry both sides of the bridge again. If she ever built her side, maybe I'd meet her there. But I wasn't walking halfway out just to be left waiting. That weekend, I took a solo day trip to the coast. No itinerary, no obligations. I parked at a trailhead I'd never been to before and followed a narrow path that wove through tall pines and opened suddenly to a cliff overlooking the ocean. I sat on a flat stone, the wind pressing into my jacket, and watched the waves fold over themselves in a rhythm older than any family drama. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, not to check a list, but to write a sentence that had been forming quietly in me for months. It read, "Let them explain the version without you. You'll be too busy living the one with peace." I didn't post it. I didn't need to. It wasn't for performance. It was just a marker in time, the place I stopped shrinking. That night, back in Portland, I cooked myself a meal without rushing. I played music I liked, read the book I'd been meaning to finish, and fell asleep with the windows cracked just enough to hear the city moving quietly below me. I woke up the next morning with a calm I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized it was the absence of anticipation. The first time in years I wasn't bracing for a text, a request, a guilt trip packaged as an update. I was simply still. By midweek, another message came in, this time from Margot. It was longer, structured like a speech she had practiced too many times. She mentioned family values, misunderstandings, and how it wasn't too late to come back into the fold. I read it once, then again. Every line was technically polite, but every subtext screamed ownership, not connection. It ended with a phrase I knew too well. "We miss the old Trudy." I sat with that for a long time before replying with a single sentence. "She's gone, but I'm not." I hit send, then archived the thread. Later that evening, I visited a small cafe run by a woman I had met at a financial wellness event months ago. We talked over espresso and shared stories not of revenge or regret, but of boundary setting and rebuilding. She told me how she once walked away from a company she helped build after realizing her name was on the work, but not the credits. I smiled and said, "Funny how invisible people often carry the whole thing." She nodded. "And how visible we become the moment we stop carrying it." When I walked home, I passed a bookstore hosting an open mic night. The chalkboard outside read, "Tell your story, even if your voice shakes." I didn't go in. Not yet, but I made a note of the date, because one day I might, and when I do, it won't be to make them look bad. It'll be to remind someone who's been erased quietly for years that they're not crazy, that silence isn't consent, that walking away isn't bitterness. It's choosing a different kind of family, one built not on obligation, but on mutual presence. The next few weeks unfolded in a rhythm that felt both foreign and perfectly right. I stopped checking the group chat, not because I'd muted it, but because it no longer existed. I wasn't blocked. They hadn't gone that far, but I had simply been removed. One minute you're coordinating brunches and booking rentals. The next, you're an empty seat no one remembers to account for. At first, I expected to feel rage. Then I waited for grief. Neither arrived. What did arrive, slowly and without fanfare, was something else entirely space, a kind of inner clarity that asked no questions and demanded no closure. The silence was no longer deafening. It was directional. Back in Portland, I leaned into that space. I took a part-time consulting gig at a community arts nonprofit. Nothing glamorous, just something that allowed me to rebuild on my terms. I started my mornings with walks, not to prepare for others, but to check in with myself, somewhere between the river paths and the quiet bookstores. I found my center again, not the version who needed to be useful to be seen, just the woman who existed, whether noticed or not. One rainy Thursday, I received a letter, not an email, a real letter, handwritten, addressed in Margot's careful script. The envelope was cream-colored and stiff, like it had been chosen for impact. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a single photograph. The photo was from that summer trip, me, mid-laugh, holding a plate of food on the back patio, taken by someone I didn't even remember standing behind a camera. I stared at it for a long while. It was one of the few moments I looked like I belonged, even though I now knew I hadn't. The letter was short. Trudy, I found this photo and thought you should have it. Maybe we didn't do everything right, but we do remember you. Love. Mom. That was all. No apology, no invitation, just a snapshot of a lie they still believed was love. I didn't write back. Instead, I slid the photo into a small wooden box on my bookshelf, a quiet archive of a version of me that no longer needed to be in anyone's album to be real. That weekend, I visited a small storytelling salon downtown. A friend from the nonprofit had invited me. Nothing performative, she said, just people telling the truth in a room full of strangers. I almost declined. Then I remembered how many times I had kept quiet to keep things easier for other people. I went. The room was dimly lit, filled with mismatched chairs and nervous smiles. When my turn came, I stood in front of maybe 20 people and said, I used to think silence meant grace, that shrinking yourself was a form of love. But then I realized, being silent in the face of harm isn't love. It's complicity dressed in politeness. I paused. No one moved. I kept going. This isn't a revenge story. It's not even a sad one. It's a story about what happens when you stop editing your existence to fit someone else's comfort, and what you find when you finally sit in a room and take up space like you were meant to. When I finished, there was no applause, just stillness. And that, somehow, felt louder than any standing ovation. After that night, things changed, not externally. No one from my family called to apologize. No redemption arc arrived in a rush of remorse. But internally, something settled. The emotional finance of it all, the constant cost of proving I belonged, was over. I no longer needed their validation to confirm my reality. I had mine. It lived in rooms full of strangers who saw the real version, the one who didn't stay quiet for the sake of group photos. One morning, while walking past a neighborhood community board, I noticed a flyer for a mentorship program, Women in Transition, not just career shifts, but emotional shifts, life after erasure. I scanned the code and signed up to volunteer, not because I had everything figured out, but because I knew the ache of being invisible in rooms where your fingerprints were on everything. A month later, I met a woman named Mira, early 40s, brilliant, recently divorced from a man who had taken credit for all her creative work in their design business. She spoke in half sentences at first, always prefacing her ideas with, I don't know if this makes sense, but I saw myself in her, the way she apologized for breathing too loudly, the way she held her coffee like a shield. After our third meeting, she looked at me and said, Do you ever feel like you're still trying to prove you deserve to be here? I smiled gently and said, Not anymore, But I remember exactly when I stopped. Mira cried, not from pain, but from permission. That's what healing becomes after a while. Not a trophy, not a speech, just quiet permission for someone else to stop shrinking too. By the end of that session, she had a business plan mapped out and had emailed her first client pitch. We didn't celebrate with fireworks, just a calm nod and an understanding that we had both reclaimed something no one could take again. One evening, weeks later, I received another email from Candace. The subject line simply read, "I understand now." No body, no explanation, just that sentence. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel vindicated. I just felt peace, because by then, I no longer needed them to understand. I had already built a life that didn't depend on their recognition. And when the final image of that family trip came up on my memories, feed the one where I stood at the edge of the beach, back turned, hands in my pockets, I didn't feel erased. I felt chosen, because I was finally facing the only direction that mattered. 3 months after the trip, I received an invitation in the mail, a real paper invitation, thick cardstock, gold lettering. It was for Eliza's 13th birthday party. The envelope didn't have a return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable Candace's inside. It said, "You're invited. We'd love for you to be there. Eliza asked for you." I held the card in my hands for a long time, running my fingers across the embossed date. It wasn't bitterness I felt. It wasn't even longing. It was something deeper and simpler choice. For the first time, the decision wasn't tangled in guilt or obligation. It was mine, free of weight. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my calendar. I hovered over the date. Then I clicked elsewhere. Not because I didn't love Eliza. I did. But love, I had learned, doesn't mean placing yourself back in rooms that undo you. Sometimes love looks like stepping away so you can return as someone whole. Sometimes love means letting others feel your absence long enough to recognize its shape. Instead of going to the party, I sent a quiet gift, no flashy branding, no forced message, just a notebook with a simple note tucked inside. Write your own version of things. You're allowed. It didn't need to be signed. She would know. And if she didn't yet, one day she would. In the weeks that followed, life didn't become perfect. It became real. That's the part people often skip in these stories. They want the final act to be a grand reveal, a vindicated comeback, an apology shouted from rooftops. But the truth is, real healing rarely performs. It just exists, quiet and persistent. Like a houseplant you almost gave up on that starts growing again the minute it's placed near the right kind of light. My apartment felt different now, not cleaner, just more honest. I had removed the subtle reminders of a version of myself I no longer needed to be. The planner that used to sit by the door, full of errands for other people, was gone. The group chat was no longer pinned. The framed photo of that beach trip now lived in a drawer, not hidden in shame, but stored as proof of how far I'd come. I no longer carried them with me, but I hadn't erased them either. I had simply let them become part of the background, not my anchor, not my burden, just part of the scenery I walked away from. On a Thursday morning, while running a workshop for women in transition, one of the attendees asked, "How do you know when you're done proving yourself?" I smiled, not because the answer was easy, but because I had lived it. I said, "When your silence is no longer heavy, when being left out stops feeling like a warning and starts feeling like relief, when you realize that being underestimated was never your failure, it was their ceiling." She nodded slowly, like the words weren't just advice, they were oxygen. That same day, I received a message from Mira, the woman I had mentored earlier. She had just launched her own design agency and landed her first client. I didn't ask anyone if I was ready. She wrote, "I just decided I was." I stared at that message for a long time, then replied, "That's what power feels like. It's not noise, it's movement." The irony was beautiful. I had started by giving away every bit of myself to gain belonging. I ended up finding it by giving nothing away, unless it was earned. Weeks later, as I was organizing documents on my laptop, I stumbled across a folder titled Styler Trip 2024. I hadn't opened it since returning. Inside were hundreds of photos, sunrises I captured while no one else was awake. Meals I plated but never ate fully. Moments I wasn't in but made happen. I scrolled, not to relive it, but to finally close it. Before I deleted the folder, I kept one photo, a candid one of me, back turned to the house, standing at the edge of the dock, staring at the horizon. I renamed it Proof, not of what they did, but of what I lived through and what I chose after. On the anniversary of that trip, I didn't post a reflection. I didn't light a symbolic candle. I went on a solo hike. No headphones, no map, just me and the trail, somewhere halfway up. I paused and sat on a rock overlooking the valley. I thought about how many times I had tried to earn softness by being useful, about how often I had confused silence for peace, and how, in the end, the only real turning point had been a quiet decision, made one night, with one finger, pressing freeze card. It's strange, the power of that moment. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cinematic, but it was mine, the beginning of a life that no longer needed their edit, and that's the lesson I carry, not just for myself, but for anyone who's been the background character in a family that ran on their labor. You don't have to burn bridges. You don't have to beg for seats. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is build a door of your own and close it softly behind you. And if they ever knock, let it be because they want to meet the version of you that doesn't shrink to fit their comfort, the one who doesn't pay to be tolerated, the one who doesn't beg to belong, because that version, she isn't bitter, she's free.